Hi, you're listening to Avril Sauter talking about CCNA Wireless. Now, in this lesson, we want to continue our discussion on wireless security, but we want to focus in on guest access. And guest access is different from when employees are connecting to your network. Guest access is when you might have a visitor to your business location and you want to use your existing wireless network that employees are using to also securely provide access to guest users without exposing the confidentiality of your business corporate network. So that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. So Cisco has defined a unified wireless guest access solution. And basically what it does is it creates a tunnel between two endpoints. And the tunnel actually isolates the guest traffic. And the tunnel exists between the wireless LAN controller that the user is connecting to what's referred to as an anchor controller. And the anchor controller is located in what's referred to as the demilitarized zone. And a demilitarized zone in IT terms is basically an area that acts as a buffer between the corporate network and the public network. For instance, a demilitarization host cannot initiate a session to the private network. It can only forward requests out to the internet. Now you can see the anchor controller in this picture up on the top right, and you can see that access is going through a firewall and then out through to the internet. And Cisco recommend that the anchor controller is dedicated for guest traffic only, that you don't do any other type of wireless LAN connectivity. So it's quite simple. You take your guest wireless LAN, that unique SSID, and you map it to a VLAN on the wireless LAN controller, on the anchor wireless LAN controller. And you're doing a layer 2 tunnel for all of your guest traffic. So you tunnel your traffic to the anchor controller, and then you do guest authentication using a web portal, which is shown here on the top right as well. And so what a guest does when they connect to the network, the first thing they do is they open up a web browser, and then they use a DNS redirect to then take it to the web portal for authentication. Until they're authenticated, their traffic is not routed out to the internet. Therefore, you want to make sure that DNS server can be reached from the anchor controller. And so putting it in this kind of topology that you see on this diagram, putting your anchor controller and your DNS and your web portal on the same side of the firewall in a demilitarized zone is a good way of configuring up your guest network access. So you're doing layer 3 authentication. For internal users, you're using layer 2 authentication, but for access control for guests, you're using layer 3 authentication. So let's talk about that next. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about the difference between layer 2 and layer 3 authentication. Now, layer 2 authentication allows you to get authenticated before you actually get an IP address. So only if you are legitimate to come onto the network do I then assign you an IP address. And so this is port security. And so 802.1x literally restricts access to the network and can prevent attacks, therefore, that depend on having an IP connection. Now, layer 3 authentication, you get your IP address first and then you get authenticated. On a wireless LAN, what that means is that you do open 802.11 authentication, which is at the layer 2, You get associated with the access point, then you get your IP address, and then you're routed to do something like a layer 3 web authentication. Now, in a corporation, you do layer 2 authentication for employees, and where you apply a layer 3 authentication is really when you start thinking about guest access. And the reason is that the users will supply, the guest users will supply initial username and password authentication, but security is not actually required for the subsequent traffic, or the traffic is simply tunneled through the anchor controller and out through to the internet. In this kind of scenario, normally what enterprises do is they route you to a web page. You'll have an acceptable usage policy that you have to agree to say, yes, I'm going to use this resource in a meaningful way. And then as soon as you've signed that, then it just passes your traffic through to the internet. Examples of layer 2 authentication is 802.1x, WPA, WPA2. Those are layer 2 authentication, and when you're doing authentication against a web server, like for instance you're on a public hotspot location, maybe you're connecting to the AT&T Wi-Fi hotspots, then that's done through layer 3 web authentication. But now we understand that we can secure our corporate network by setting up these tunnels to an access controller. The other aspect comes in, how do we manage the user's credentials? And what we want to do is we want to set it up such that a lobby administrator could create credentials for the guest on a temporary basis. So maybe they create them from 9 to 5 during the normal working day, or for 24 hours, or for the working week. And so we want to be able to set it up such that these user credentials can be set up on a temporary basis. And there's two ways this can be done. It can be done on the wireless control system, where it's possible to set up a lobby administrator's account that has limited privileges. So it's set up like a network administrator on the wireless control system, but very, very limited capabilities. If you don't have a central wireless control system, then it can be set up on the wireless LAN controller. So once you've set up your lobby administrator with rights to set up accounts but not rights to do anything else, they will sign on to the wireless control system through an interface specifically for lobby administrators, and they will be able to select an option to add a user, which will display a screen like this, and they can key in the guest information and either generate a password or create a password. The profile option here actually allows them to display a list of wireless LANs that they want to give access to, and then it's got some time limits. So you can select limited or unlimited. If the guest account is limited, you have to select the day and the month and the time as to when it's going to expire. And then you've got the apply to, and this is simply where the lobby administrator would select the anchor controller. And then of course you've got the standard disclaimer, and this can then be printed out or it can be emailed to the user. The email, the printed output, would just give the guest user their name, tell them the password, tell them what the SSID or the wireless LAN profile that they want to connect to, tell them the start time and end time that this credential is valid for, and then it would print the disclaimer. Now, if you don't have a central wireless control system, then you can also set up a lobby administrator's account on the wireless LAN controller. That's the Anchor wireless LAN controller. And you can see the setup somewhat similar. You can enter a username and the password they're going to use to access the wireless network. You can have that password generated for you, or you can put it in yourself. It defines the lifetime that these credentials will be valid for. You'll select the wireless LAN SSID, which applies to this account, and then you'll enter a description for this user, like visitor. Now you can use the wireless control system or wireless LAN controller to create user accounts, or both. The thing you have to watch for is, if you're using both, is to make sure that your wireless LAN controller and your wireless control system are actually synchronized. And if not, what can happen is your lobby administrator may try to create an account that already exists on the wireless LAN controller, or may not have visibility to it, so may not be able to access that information. And you should be aware that if you set anything up on the wireless control system, it will actually override the local configuration. What I've personally seen is that guests that are long-term tend to be set up on the wireless control system, and then ones that are more temporary tend to be set up on the wireless LAN system, if you have both. But again, think through, if you're going to use both, think through and make sure that you are managing it in a way that makes sense for your business, because if they aren't quite synced up, you can end up with some problems. So just one key term from this lesson that you need to know, and that's the lobby administrator. Cisco also referred to that as the lobby ambassador as well. And this is an administrative account, but it has very limited privileges. So you can't do everything on the wireless LAN controller, but you can create a guest account and you can manage that guest account. Thank you for listening to this lesson.